The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Norman.
Madam Speaker, I have a unanimous consent request at the desk.
Unanimous consent.
My request is to allow a 30-second moment of silence for the passing of Rush Limbaugh, one of the greatest radio hosts ever, and make that as a formal request.
The chair cannot entertain the gentleman's request, but the chair can recognize the gentleman's debate time.
Madam Speaker, may I request a point of personal privilege?
It's not available at this time. The gentleman has been recognized for debate.
The gentleman has been recognized for debate, and a point of personal privilege is not recognized at this time.
Madam Chair, we reserve.
The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 3 minutes to the distinguished sponsor of this legislation, the gentleman from Rhode Island, Representative Cicilline.
Madam Speaker, discrimination is wrong. We all know that. As children, we learn the golden rule: treat others the way you yourself want to be treated. But right now, discrimination is a fact of life for millions of LGBTQ Americans. The fact is that in most states, an LGBTQ person is at risk of being denied housing, education, or the right to serve on a jury just because of who they are. That's why we're here today to consider H.R. 5, the Equality Act. The Equality Act does no more and no less than say LGBTQ people deserve the same rights and responsibilities as all other Americans, most fundamentally the right to live lives free of discrimination. It builds on the Civil Rights Act and other existing laws to extend anti-discrimination protections to lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender Americans. President Biden has said getting this bill signed into law is one of his top priorities for his first 100 days in office. And I want to thank him and a few other folks for making this bill a priority: Speaker Pelosi, Majority Leader Hoyer, Whip Clyburn, and the co-chairs of the LGBTQ Equality Caucus, Mark Takano, Mark Pocan, Sean Patrick Maloney, Angie Craig, Sharice Davids, Chris Pappas, Mondaire Jones, and Richie Torres. Thank you all for being true champions for our community. Madam Speaker, every American deserves to be treated with respect and dignity. That's why the Equality Act that's what the Equality Act will achieve for the LGBT community by providing protection against discrimination in employment, education, housing, credit, jury service, public accommodations, and federal funding. I'm proud to say this bill has broad support from across the political spectrum, including groups from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to the ACLU and everyone in between. 83% of Americans support this bill, including 68%, more than 2 out of 3 Republican voters. To my friends on the other side of the aisle, as you consider this bill, I hope you will bear in mind how your vote will be remembered years from now. Will you be remembered in the same breath as all those who fought for equal rights in the past, the Freedom Riders, the suffragettes, the anti-apartheid activists? Or will you be remembered along with those who stood in the way of progress? This vote is personal for me and personal for millions of LGBTQ people and our loved ones. You all have family members, friends, and co-workers who identify as LGBTQ. I want to ask you to ask yourself what this vote means for them, and how you will look them in the eye if you vote to uphold the current system that allows them to be discriminated against. The LGBT community has waited long enough. The time has come to extend the blessings of liberty and equality to all Americans, regardless of who they are and who they love. Vote yes, pass the Equality Act today. And with that, Madam Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from New York, Mr. Jeffries.
Gentleman's recognized.
Some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have spent this debate lecturing us about foundational principles in this country. The foundational document of this great republic is the Declaration of Independence, with the words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equally." Those words were eloquent in their articulation, incomplete in their application. It did not apply to African Americans. It did not apply to women. It did not apply to Native Americans. And it certainly did not apply to members of the LGBTQ community. Now, we've come a long way in America, but we still have a long way to go. The progress has been made because, as the great Barbara Jordan once indicated, through a process of amendment and ratification and court decision and legislation. That's what we're doing today. If you believe in liberty and justice for all, support the Equality Act. If you believe in equal protection under the law, support the Equality Act. If you believe truly, as my religion teaches me, that we are all God's children, support the Equality Act. Love does not discriminate, neither should the law.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, we reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from Washington, Representative Jayapal.
Gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in strong support of the Equality Act. I am the proud mom of a trans kid. I will fight every single day for every trans person, every LGBTQ person, including my kid, to explore and express the fullness of their gender without fear or risk of being fired, denied housing, or refused service because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. Mr. Speaker, in 2020, over 1 in 3 LGBTQ Americans faced discrimination, including over 3 of 5 transgender Americans. And in the midst of a pandemic, nearly 3 in 10 LGBTQ Americans face difficulties accessing medical care, including over half of transgender Americans. The Equality Act guarantees protection under the law no matter who you love or your gender identity. It was President Abraham Lincoln who said, "Those who deny freedom for others deserve it not for themselves." So today, as we pass the Equality Act, we vote aye for Janak, for Evie, for so many thousands more of our kids, and we say to every LGBTQ person, we see you, we hear you. Thank you, Mr.
Gentleman's time has
Speaker.
expired. Gentleman from Ohio is recognized. Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, we reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Dean.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I thank
Gentleman is recognized.
Representative David Cicilline for his tireless leadership in leading us to this day. All Americans deserve to be treated equally regardless of their gender identity or sexual orientation. I do have to wonder, Mr. Speaker, what are those on the other side who are arguing against this wise legislation afraid of? Equal treatment for their LGBTQ family and friends? Why would they make such arguments? We must continue to strive for the equality of the LGBTQ community. Voting yes on the Equality Act furthers this fight and helps us live up to the promise of this nation. As Baynard Rustin, an openly gay Black civil rights leader, said, "Let us be enraged about injustice, but let us not be destroyed by it." The Equality Act is a necessary step in addressing injustice by advancing the rights of Americans nationwide. Because we are all God's children, the passage of this legislation is an important step in forming a more perfect union. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Jones.
Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, it is not often that this chamber does remarkable things. Today, we passed the Equality Act, which includes my bill, the Juror Non-Discrimination Act. This has been a long time coming, and it represents progress that, for me, was unbelievable when I was growing up. You see, to grow up poor, Black, and gay is to not see yourself anywhere. It is also to feel completely unseen, as so many people around you invalidate your very existence. Growing up, I watched helplessly as opportunistic, straight politicians, mostly white, mostly male, used my basic human rights as a political football to further their careers. Had this legislation been enacted when I was growing up, it would have been direct evidence of the fact that things really do get better, that I didn't have to hide or cry so much. Thankfully, since childhood, things have gotten better. But that hasn't been because of the mere passage of time. It's been because LGBTQ advocates made life better. Today, we send a powerful message to millions of LGBTQ people around the country and indeed around the world that they are seen, that they are valued, that their lives are worthy of being protected. How remarkable that is, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman yields back. Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Missouri, Ms. Bush.
Gentlewoman from Missouri is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. St. Louis and I rise today in support of the Equality Act because all people deserve to live safely and freely. When we say that Black lives matter, we mean that every Black life matters, that Black trans lives matter, that Nina Pop's life, her life mattered. When we protect the lives of our trans family, our unhoused neighbors, our sex workers, our youth, we build a country where everyone can thrive, not just survive. For so many in St. Louis, this bill will be the difference between life and death. Missouri has not only stalled justice, but actively denied justice for our LGBTQIA+ community. This legislation will mean the difference between having a safe place to call home and being unhoused, because today, in the year 2021, that kind of discrimination, it still exists. We rise to tell our LGBTQIA community that not only do you matter, but you are loved and you are cared for, and we got your back. Thank you to Chairman Nadler and to Rep. Cicilline. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
Mr. Speaker, we
Gentleman
reserve.
reserves. Gentleman from Ohio.
Mr. Speaker, we reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Minnesota, Ms. Craig.
Gentlewoman from Minnesota is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to offer my support to the Equality Act, a groundbreaking piece of legislation that will grant equal protection under the law to our LGBTQ friends, family, neighbors, as well as to me and my family. As the first openly lesbian wife and mother in Congress and the first LGBTQ member from the great state of Minnesota, I know this legislation is the culmination of a lifetime of work for so many. My wife Cheryl and I have built a beautiful life together, raising 4 sons who we dearly love. We are fortunate to live in Minnesota, in a state where many of the Equality Act's protections have already been enshrined into law. Right now, there are states across this country where it would be entirely legal for Cheryl and I to be discriminated against based on our love and commitment to one another in housing, employment, access to credit, or any other number of areas essential to just living our lives. Now, some of my colleagues seem to believe this legislation somehow could harm our non-LGBTQ women and girls, but that couldn't be further from the truth. The Equality Act does not undermine the achievements or aspirations of non-LGBTQ women. In fact, by amending the Civil Rights Act to prohibit discrimination on the basis of sex in a broad area of life, we are fighting to ensure that all women are treated equally in all aspects of their lives. The Equality Act is critical because when LGBTQ people have equality under the law, we all benefit and all of our communities are stronger. As a teenage girl growing up in rural America, I never could have imagined I'd finally see this legislation come to the House floor, much less as a member of this body to see it pass. This legislation is necessary, it's long overdue, and I urge my colleagues to support it. Thank you, and I yield back.
From Ohio.
Reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Pocan.
Gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, I had a different speech I was going to give today about the Equality Act. As an openly gay member of Congress, married to my husband Phil for 14 years, I was going to talk about the need for equal treatment under the law for everyone, regardless of who they love. Human kindness, respect for others, pretty basic stuff. but the new QAnon vibe on this body has gone too far. For many in this chamber, this isn't a debate about whether or not you should be legally discriminated against for who you love. You won't hear that debate because they can't win on hate alone. The public doesn't agree with them. So instead, some are debating that this bill discriminates based on religion, which it doesn't, because it treats everyone the same under the law. And some are debating an even sillier notion that somehow a man will pretend to be a woman to win in women's sports, a crazy, made-up fantasy notion. This new QAnon spirit across the aisle is also occurring in a nasty and hateful way. A lead GOP opponent of this bill actually posted an anti-trans poster on the wall outside her office directly and intentionally across from a Democratic member of Congress with a trans daughter. Wow, that's classy. Really, is that where we are here today? Who can out-crazy, out-tastelessly act to prove to the base that they'll say or do anything to score points and show how inconsiderate they can be to a colleague to just get social media clickbait? Here are the facts. 1 in 4 transgender people have lost a job due to discrimination, and dozens of transgender and gender nonconforming people were violently killed last year. And LGBT youth are almost 5 times as likely to have attempted suicide compared to heterosexual youth due to discrimination. It is past time we put an end to this. A vote against the Equality Act is a vote for discrimination, plain and simple. This isn't Iran or Somalia or Russia. This is America. Show human dignity for others by offering equal treatment under the law. That's the Equality Act. I yield back.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from New York, Mr. Torres.
The gentleman from New York is recognized.
As a child of the Bronx who grew up in the projects, I was often too scared to come out of the closet, too blinded by fear to see clearly my own value, my own equality. My younger self could have never imagined standing on the floor of the House as a member of Congress, voting for legislation that, if enacted, would make me equal in the eyes of the law. As the first LGBTQ Afro-Latino member of Congress, I feel palpably the weight of history on my shoulders, and on behalf of my community, I am here to claim what discrimination denies: equal protection under the law. Indeed, we are here to uphold the abiding truth of the American experiment, that we are all created equal, and that none of us should be evicted, fired, or denied accommodations and services simply because of who we are and because of whom we love. We are equal by nature, and we ought to be equal by law. The logic of equality is as simple as that. Yesterday, a member of Congress said that the Equality Act was, quote, immoral, disgusting, and evil. I wish to set the record straight. What is truly immoral and disgusting and evil is discrimination. It always has been, and it always will be. Discrimination denies us our deepest humanity. The profound degradation it causes has no place in a society that pledges liberty and justice for all. And so I hope that my colleagues, all of them, will find the moral courage to uphold what the Declaration of Independence promises and what the Equality Act delivers: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all of us, without exception, without discrimination. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Ohio reserves. Gentleman from New York.
Mr. Stubbe, what any religious tradition ascribes as God's will is no concern of this Congress. I now yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Massachusetts, Ms. Clark.
Members are advised to address their comments to the chair. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you. A few years ago at a town hall in my district, a young student asked me, what is Congress going to do to protect trans people like me? He bravely stood before an auditorium of neighbors and told me he was terrified by the bigotry and discrimination against him and his LGBTQ plus community members. I have heard these fears expressed by my own non-binary child, and their fears are not misplaced. Our LGBTQ neighbors face discrimination in healthcare, housing, education, and employment. Even here in the People's House, members of Congress are describing transgender people as something less than, as undeserving and illegitimate. Today, our vote for the Equality Act says to every person, you matter, that you deserve to live your truth for respect and dignity, that there will be no true freedom for anyone until there is equality for everyone.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Reserve.
Gentleman
Mr. Speaker.
reserves. Gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
And still I rise, Mr. Speaker. You used God to enslave my foreparents. You used God to segregate me in school. You used God to put me in the back of the bus. Have you no shame? God created every person in this room. Are you saying that God made a mistake? This is not about God, it's about men who choose to discriminate against other people because they have the power to do so. My record will not show that I voted against Mr. Cicilline having his rights. My record will show that when I had the opportunity to deliver liberty and justice for all, I voted for rights for all.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman reserves. Gentleman.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 30 seconds to the distinguished gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Kildee.
The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm happy to be here today, to be on the record in favor of this legislation. No one should be fired from their job or evicted from their home because who they are or who they love. This legislation will guarantee that our LGBTQ friends and neighbors and family will be full members of the American family and with all the protections that comes with that. I'll just ask one question before I sit down. For anyone who ever wondered what they would have done in those days in the early 1960s when the civil rights legislation was being debated here, let me just say this. Whatever you're doing now is what you would have done then.